Hey, hi everyone. My name is Joanne. Welcome to another session of TICU tutorials. I'll be taking the topic consumer theory and production theory today. And at the end of the session, the aim is that everyone should know what um, what it is for a consumer to maximize utility and a producer to maximize inputs and minimize costs. So firstly, before we go into the main topics, we need to know that every economy is made of markets. And so when we talk economy, we talk markets. So when you hear of an economy, we're talking of markets. And there are different types of markets. We have the labor market, we have financial services markets, and we have the commodity markets. We have other type of markets. And in each of these markets, there are different players or participants. These players are also called participants. The players are basically firms and individuals. However, they are called different names in the different markets. And one thing about these players is that they both have interests. For example, in the financial services market, the players are the firms, which are banks, stockbrokers, and so on, and the individuals are the customers, the people that enjoy the services of this bank. Both the firms and the individuals have their own interests, just like in other markets. Like in the commodity markets, we have the producer and we have the consumer. Both have their own interest, and the firm's interest is majorly to maximize profit. They also have other interests such as maximizing market shares, creating value, minimizing cost, and so on. The consumers also have their own interests of maximizing utility. Consumers want to get the best of the bundle with a budget constraint. They want to get the best of the bundle for their income. So when they are buying something, they want to get the best possible alternative with their money. So now consumer theory, and that's what we'll be looking at today, the behavior of these consumers and producers. Consumer theory, what is consumer theory? Consumer theory is a branch of microeconomics that studies how consumers make choices about what to buy. It explains how consumers maximize their utility while also considering their budget constraints. As I said earlier, consumers' interest is to maximize utility and get the best bundles. So this theory, consumer theory, is studying how consumers maximize the utility with their given constraint, which is their income. It studies how people decide to spend their money based on their taste and their constraints. The value a consumer places on a unit of a good or service depends on the pleasure or satisfaction he or she expects to derive from having or consuming it at the point of making a consumption or consumer choice. So the value I place on, let me say, water depends on how much water satisfies me after taking water. That's basically what this point is explaining. And in economics, this satisfaction I derive from water, from the consumption of water, is called utility. However, consumers cannot have everything they wish to have. Consumers' choices are constrained by their incomes. Because I want water, I want ice cream, I want drinks, does not mean I can get it because I have an income constraint. I don't have all the money in the world to get everything I want. Therefore, I have a constraint. Within the limits of this income, consumers make their consumption choices by evaluating and comparing consumer goods with regard to their utilities. So if I want to get water, I want to get wine, I want to get ice cream, what I will end up getting because of my limited income will depend on the amount of utility, amount of satisfaction I derive from those goods I want to get. So consumers choose the best bundles of goods they can afford. So there are two parts. Number one, that they can afford, that's the budget constraint. And number two, the best, according to my preference. For example, the water, ice cream, and wine I gave. If wine is what I want the most, what I like the most, and my money can my income can afford it, I'm going to choose the wine. And under consumer theory, there are various assumptions. Number one, rational behavior. It is assumed that consumers behave rationally. They make rational decisions to maximize their utility. I will not, it is assumed that I, I am reasonable. I will not get wine over water if water is what I really need at that point, or if water is what my income can afford at that point. Consumers are utility maximizers. That means I maximize my utility the most. Then facing choices X and Y, a consumer would either prefer X to Y or Y to X, or would be indifferent about between them. That means I will either prefer wine to ice cream, or prefer ice cream to wine, or prefer none. That means I'm indifferent about that. Then transitivity. It is assumed that if a consumer prefers X to Y and Y to Z, we conclude he or she prefers X to Z. That means if I prefer ice cream to wine and I prefer wine to water, that means I also prefer ice cream to water. Then consistent preferences. It is assumed that consumers' preferences remain consistent over time. That means if I prefer wine to water today, tomorrow I'll prefer wine to water, next day I'll prefer wine to water. That's basically what this assumption is talking on. Then complete information. It is assumed that consumers have complete information about the goods and services available. Diminishing marginal utility. This states that as more and more of a good is consumed by a consumer, ceteris paribus, beyond a certain point, the utility of each additional unit starts to fall. That means the more I consume a good, let's say the more I consume water, at a certain point, the additional utility I derive from water begins to fall. So when you hear anything marginal in economics, just know it's additional. So it's like, if I'm really famished, I'm really thirsty, and I consume water now, the satisfaction I get will be very high. Then I consume another, let's say, sachet of water, I'm going to still feel it. But if I keep consuming to the extent that I consume 10 sachets of water, at a point I'll become too full, and then the water, I'm not actually being satisfied by the water anymore. That's what this diminishing marginal utility is talking about. So the satisfaction I get from taking another sachet of water will fall as I continue to consume more sachets of water. So now there are approaches to consumer theory. So there are two main approaches to consumer theory, and the first one is the ordinal approach, and the second one is the cardinal approach. So I'll be looking at the ordinal approach. The ordinal approach, also called the indifference curve approach, refers to the concept of ranking consumer preferences for goods or services based on their relative desirability, without assigning numerical values to the level of satisfaction. So I don't need to, when I explain the cardinal, I will explain the differences between the two. So key concepts. Number one, indifference curve. Indifference curve is a graphical representation of combinations of goods that yield the same level of satisfaction. Indifference curves are typically downward sloping, indicating that as consumption of one good increases, consumption of the other must decrease to maintain the same level of satisfaction. So indifference curve is simply a graphical representation of a combination of goods. Let's say I'm consuming water and I'm consuming biscuits. Indifference curve shows the amount of water and the amount of biscuit I consume, and on the same indifference curve, the same level of satisfaction is derived. Let's say I have an indifference curve, is usually downward sloping. Even if I consume 8 sachets of water and I consume 6 sachets of biscuits, and if I increase my consumption of water. That means the consumption of biscuits will decrease. As far as it's still on that same indifference curve, that means it still means I'm getting the same level of satisfaction irrespective of the change in the consumption of the goods. Then number 2, budget constraints. A graphical budget constraint is a graphical representation of the combinations of goods that are purchased given income and prices. Consumer equilibrium. Consumer equilibrium occurs where the indifference curve is tangent to the budget constraint. This simply means when the slope of the indifference curve is equal to the slope of the budget constraint. I will explain that more when I begin the calculation. It represents the optimal combination of goods that maximizes the consumer satisfaction given their income and prices. So this is just an example. Suppose we have an indifference curve that shows combinations of apples and bananas that yield. Our budget constraint is $10 and the prices of apples and bananas are $2 and $1 respectively. The optimal combination of goods occurs where the indifference curve is tangent to the budget constraint, which may be 3 apples and 4 bananas. I'll explain this later when I begin the calculation. Then now the second approach is the cardinal approach, also known as the marginal utility approach. This involves assigning numerical values to the level of satisfaction a consumer receives from a good or service. So when I explained the ordinal, I said ordinal basically deals with ranking consumer preferences. But here, a value is actually attached to the utility derived from a good. Let's say I'm consuming biscuits. Cardinal approach believes that they can measure the utility of the biscuit I consumed, and this measurement, they're usually measured in utils. So key concepts, we have utility function, a mathematical function that assigns a numeric value to each combination of goods consumed. That's the utility as a function of x and y, where x and y are the goods consumed. Then we have marginal utility. As I explained earlier, it is the change in utility resulting from a 1 unit increase in consumption of a good. And marginal utility of x is basically the differentiation of utility with respect to x. Then diminishing marginal utility, I've explained that earlier, and it states that marginal utility of a good decreases as consumption increases. So the ordinal utility approach assumes that utility can only be ranked or ordered. Ordinal utility does not believe that you can tell me that the amount of utility I derived from drinking water is 7 utils, while cardinal believes that it can be measured in that way. So ordinal tells you which is preferred. It tells me that I prefer water to wine. I prefer to take wine to ice cream. While cardinal will tell you how much more preferred one option is. Cardinal can tell you I derive 7 utils from drinking water, I derive 5 utils from drinking wine, and I derive 3 from taking ice cream. So that's just the introduction to consumer theory. And the consumer theory is based on the concept of diminishing marginal utility. And diminishing marginal utility is what I explained earlier, that the more you take of a product, the less satisfaction you derive from it, or the more you take a product, the less you want, the less it satisfies you, basically. It occurs when the marginal utility gained from consuming an additional unit of a good decreases as the total consumption of that good increases. A real life example of diminishing marginal utility. Let's say you love eating ice cream. In the first scoop, you are excited and you enjoy it so much. So that's high marginal utility. When you take the second scoop, it's still delicious, but because you've taken it before, you are like satisfied, like not necessarily satisfied, but like the satisfaction you get from the second scoop and subsequent scoops will not be as high as the satisfaction you got from the first scoop. Then when you take the third scoop, you are getting full. Not necessarily the third scoop, because I know people might be like, oh, no, but like let's say the like 12th or 50th scoop, you get full and you no longer derive such satisfaction from it. So that's a low marginal utility. From high to low to lower. Then you take, the more you keep taking, let's say you are full and you keep taking, you may even fall sick because of the adverse effects of too much ice cream, and that's a negative marginal utility. So this basically explains the concept of diminishing marginal utility. So before I go to the calculation, I'll quickly explain production theory. Production theory is like the opposite of consumer theory. So basically this deals with producers. Consumer theory, as the name implies, deals with consumers. So consumer theory, production theory is to producers what consumer theory is. Production theory is therefore a branch of microeconomics that studies the behavior of firms in producing goods and services. It explains how firms make decisions about production levels, pricing, and input combinations to maximize profit. As I explained at the beginning, that the interest of a firm is, one of the interests is to maximize profit. So production theory basically explains how these firms make decisions in order to achieve that interest. Producers choose combination of inputs that they can use to produce a given amount of output that maximizes profits. And there are two parts, just like there were two parts to consumer theory. There are two parts here. And number one is feasible choice of inputs, which is the technology constraint, and then substitutability of inputs, which is cost constraint. I will explain that more when we study calculation aspects. Assumptions, profit maximization. Firms aim to maximize profits. Obviously, no business wants to engage in a business without to make loss. Even non-government organizations still make little profits. Then perfect knowledge. Firms have complete information about market conditions, technology, and input prices. Then firms operate within a given technology. So the concept of production refers to the process of transforming inputs into outputs, transforming raw materials into finished goods. Production involves inputs. Those are the factors of production. It involves raw materials to be combined in proper proportion and processes. It involves applying human strength, ingenuity, and tools or machines. It involves ultimately transforming inputs to outputs in order to make value, create value, which is one of their interests, as I said earlier. Production process is the system of activities by which inputs are transformed into outputs per unit of time. So, production technology, which is also known as production function, it indicates the highest output that a firm can produce for every specified combination of inputs given the state of technology. It displays what is technically feasible when the firm operates efficiently. That means when producers are rational. It includes all the technically efficient methods of production. It focuses on the level of employment of the factor inputs. And the two aspects of production functions are returns to scale. That's when output expands, when all inputs are increased. This is basically in the long run, when all variables and when all inputs become variable. Then elasticity of substitution, how easily one input could be replaced by another while maintaining the same level of outputs. That's, for example, if I want to make fruit juice and my fruit juice ingredients are watermelon, orange, and pineapple. It's like saying, how can I substitute pineapple for watermelon, but I'm still deriving the same quantity of fruit juice? That's basically elasticity of substitution, and it's based on law of diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution. And law of diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution is like just what marginal rate of substitution is to the consumer. That's what marginal rate of technical substitution is to the producer, and it is basically the rate at which a producer substitutes one input for another, giving the same level of output. Law of production, we have the time frame, that's short run and long run. The time frame of production can be classified into two categories, that's short run and long run. Short run is a situation where there is at least one fixed variable and then other inputs are, I mean when there is at least one fixed input and then other inputs are variable. For example, let's say Covenant University, right now, because we have, Covenant University, right now we have fixed inputs like the building, the halls, and some other things. And then variable inputs include the lecturers, this stuff, and let me say books and all. But so basically we're in the short run, but in a long run, whereby let's say all of a sudden Covenant University decides to admit more than the capacity of students it can, or rather Covenant University decides to admit like more students than this building, than the halls of residences can contain. Covenant University will have to build more buildings, more halls, more college buildings, and so on. So in this case, there's no fixed input, because even the buildings have become variable. So that's a long run situation. And then we have variable proportions, that refers to the ability to change the mix of inputs in the production process. And it is substitution, replacing one input with another, as I explained with the watermelon and orange. Then technology, improving the production process through innovation or new technologies. Let's say normally I make my fruit juice using my hand to blend it, but now I use an electric blender. That's basically what technological change is about. And then we'll be looking at isoquants. Isoquant is a very important aspect in production theory, and it represents the various combinations of inputs that yield the same level of output. So isoquant is to the producer what indifference curve is to the consumer. So isoquant has to do with various inputs. Let's say I need this board. My inputs are capital and labor to get this board. To get like 2 of these boards, or more, basically the combination of inputs to get an output. Then properties of isoquants. We have isoquants are downward sloping. That means as the quantity of one input increases, the quantity of the other input must decrease to maintain the same level of output. So if I want to produce this board and I employ 2 units of labor and I use 5 units of capital to produce the board, if I want to increase my labor, that means capital must decrease to produce these same outputs. Then it is convex to the origin, also for the same reason, because as the quantity of one input increases, the quantity of the second input decreases, and that's the law of diminishing marginal rate of technical substitution that I explained. Isoconts are continuous. That means inputs are continuously substitutable. That means I can continuously substitute my amount of labor for amount of capital to produce this board. Number 4, isoconts do not intersect. Just like indifferent curves do not intersect, isoconts cannot intersect. As I said earlier, isocont is to the producer what indifference curve is to the consumer.